often have goals and ambitions that we yearn to attain in our lifetime. For me, that was establishing a world altitude record. The aircraft of choice was an SP-140. It's an electric paramotor that's fairly new to the paramotor world. Pilots are often skeptical with electric aircraft, primarily due to the longevity of the batteries, and fire hazards are also a concern. However, the SP-140 is a phenomenal paramotor. Its performance characteristics are very exceptional, and even its battery duration is very impressive comparative to what electric paramotors had come from in the beginning. Now, our goal today was not so much to establish an altitude record, but to see how the SP-140 would do in very harsh conditions. And what I mean by harsh conditions, that the temperatures we were going to put this through were nearly 10 below zero or greater, and the wind conditions we were going to be flying in were 30 knots plus at the altitude that we were going to be at. With these conditions, it meant that I had to dress warm, and the gear that I was using was a U.S. Air Force Cold War era insulated flight suit, which would be fitting to the conditions that we were going to be flying in. Now, the area that we were flying from was Leadville, Colorado, and people often ask, well, why did you choose Leadville, Colorado, and why did you choose winter flying conditions versus summer? Well, the air stability in the winter at the location that we were at is much greater in the winter versus spring or summer. The volatile wind conditions going through the mountains meant that we needed a perfect day. And the day that we chose still was not ideal. However, it was better than any other predicted day on the forecast. Originally, I was going to choose a 32-meter Hadron Cabrio for the glider of choice. However, with the winds aloft predicted to be 30 knots or greater, it meant that I had to go with a much smaller wing. So my choice of wing was a Gin Carve 18-meter. I was used to this wing, but the downfall is that it was much smaller than our intended wing size that we were going to use. A smaller wing meant that my climb rate wouldn't be near as good, and the overall altitude objective would be much less than what would have been acquired with the Dudek Hadron Cabrio. However, an 18-meter wing has a lot better penetration value and 30 knot plus winds aloft, and so that meant that was really my only choice for today's flight. With one last check on the gear and one last check to make sure that our sealed altimeters that an FAI observer was going to install on myself and the aircraft was meaning that this record and this attempt to achieve this record was going to be not only a first in the world, but it would be a first for our team, and it was a very exciting moment. I wasn't so much nervous about the flight itself or the type of conditions that I would be flying in. I was more nervous about having all our T's crossed and our I's dotted. When dealing with a world altitude record, everything has to be by the book. And that meant that the altimeters had to be on, they had to be certified, that the area that we were taking off from takeoff to landing, was approved by the FAI, and that all the rules and regulations were followed accordingly, or else this record would not be official by the FAI standards. Jeremy here, who's the owner of this paramotor, did one last checkup on the unit, and Daniel's helping me getting loaded up, carabiners locked with the risers, and making one more pre-flight check before our attempt at this altitude. Now, originally with the 32 Cabrio, we were expecting to get between 16 to 18,000 feet, but I was flying a much smaller wing now, and that meant that the overall altitude goal was going to be much smaller. We didn't know what to expect. In fact, the temperatures that we were going to be flying this electric paramotor at, we figured that the longevity would be cut nearly in half on the batteries, just because the temperatures and cold temps and primarily kill a battery's longevity. This is the final moment. The first takeoff on this electric paramotor, and it's official that we're about to begin this attempt. Climb out was smooth. An electric paramotor's thrust is incredible. We have no loss of power really, being that it's electric, versus where you're talking, 3% every 1,000 feet for a gas-powered paramotor. the conditions for today at the surface were about 8 degrees Fahrenheit, and winds aloft at the surface were about 9 miles per hour. This, however, was going to increase a lot the higher I got. In fact, at 10,000 to 12,000 feet was nearly a 30 knot increase in winds aloft. So that meant I was going from 9 knots to 39 knots at 12,000 feet. Now, another question that is often asked is, were you holding this wide open throttle to get to your altitude record? And the answer is no. In fact, I was using maybe 30% throttle. And why this is because electric battery can be consumed much faster if you were just to go a 100% thrust output. This meant that I would get to an altitude very quickly. However, the longevity to the initial highest point would be reduced significantly. And I found out after we did some calculations that by going at 30% throttle, 30 to 40% throttle, would mean that my duration would be much greater and my climb rate wasn't much less than if I was going full power. It's more of an efficiency game, and I really had to be smart about this because the wing that I was originally going to fly was much bigger than the one that I'm on now. It's very apparent midway through this flight, as you can see, the turbulence was significant, and I was only maybe halfway through on my climb out. I knew that the winds were going to be rough, but the biggest issue is that when you're dealing with mountain flying, it's a whole nother realm. You have a phenomenon called rotor, and when you have a massive amount of wind rolling through mountain valleys, this rotor increases significantly. So I must say, the stability of the Gin Carb 18 had exceeded my expectations, especially the conditions that I was putting it through. The temperature initially at my highest point here, when I looked at the thermometer, was about 13 below zero. And that's 13 below zero Fahrenheit. So any exposed skin is going to succumb to frostbite very quickly. The power output and the battery duration had more than exceeded my expectations. In fact, I was shocked to see how little the overall battery percentage was decreasing in my initial climb out. I often checked to see what altitude I was at, what the temperature was, and basing off my calculations to see how much higher I could go. As you can see, we're about 12,800 here, and I still have about 40% battery left. The cool part was I got to a certain altitude and things kind of smoothed out. That was kind of refreshing. It gave me time to kind of stretch out my hands. The biggest factor I realized with an issue was that the warmth in my hands was diminishing very fast. In fact, I was hiding my hands underneath an area to reduce its exposure to the wind. My glove choices were not the best on this flight, mainly due I wanted a thinner glove so I could grab the brake toggles and touch the altimeter screen. And I couldn't do that with heated gloves, they're just too bulky. However, at this point, I really wished I had heated gloves because my hands were hurting quite badly from the temperatures. So I had initially flown until I had gotten a hard power cutoff. Now that meant that the battery had shut off completely and the electric paramotor had powered down. So I had a fairly long glide back from my initial altitude on this attempt. I also had another issue. The wind had blown me so far off course that when the paramotor had powered down, I was at a significant distance from the airport to the point that I didn't know if I would be able to glide back, knowing that I was flying into a significantly high headwind. But my landing had come with ease, and I was really happy to be on the ground. The biggest problem that I had was my hands were hurting really bad. In fact, my right hand had stopped responding. I could no longer feel it. And, well, this was just the beginning. I had to grab my wing, pack everything up, and then we had an attempt to set another altitude record in a paramotor trike with my girlfriend Stevie. Now this record that we were going to go for is a record that was held by Hungary since 2003. And the trike that we were going to use was a Zenit Cosmos 300 on a Fly Products trike. Now I'm doing a walk back with Jeremy. I'm so happy he was here with me because, frankly, the walk back was a long distance to carry that paramotor. My hands were still hurting significantly from this last flight, but we knew that our window before the winds increased even higher was closing very fast. So got re-geared back up. Stevie got geared back up, and we were about ready to attempt our second record attempt, and that was the Tandem trike altitude record, which was currently at 15,600 feet. Stevie is a trooper here. She never says no to a task, even when it's quite dangerous, such as this one today, and I admire her for that. I must say that the team that we had today was incredible. Everybody was so helpful, and really this record would have never happened without the help of all these amazing souls. Our takeoff was textbook. The winds were increasing, but we got off the ground fairly quick, and we were in a climb out. The wing of choice was a Dudek 42-meter tandem wing, which is very boaty comparative to the 18-meter gin carve that I was using in the previous flight. Thanks to Christian Oha for capturing all this great imagery on this adventure. He's an incredible filmmaker, and I'll post his contact details in the description below because he's truly a very talented cinematographer. Before we took off, I did one more check on the winds aloft, and they had actually increased even more since our original prediction that morning. The biggest issue that we were facing with this flight was the turbulence was really rough. In fact, it got to a point where I was seeing the sky and the ground every few seconds. And for us, that was a major problem because we knew that the turbulence was going to increase even more the higher we got. But we pushed on in hopes that the air might possibly smooth out. However, another 15 minutes into the flight, the turbulence became even worse, and I made the call out of safety concerns to cancel this attempt and go back to the LZ and land. We landed successfully, and we were happy to be on the ground after this turbulent flight.
It was a massive tilt-a-whirl. I think if I had a better climb rate, I think we would have continued because we hardly burned any gas. But I think we just made the call. It was just too turbulent. It got bumpy.
Saw you. I was watching your altitude, up, down.
Yeah, it was all over the place. So I was like, you know what? Yeah, I was like, we're not. If we had like a solid climb rate, I'm like, we're just gonna deal with this.
Yeah, I was watching it.
But then I felt
a sink.
And I just started sinking back down again. I'm like, we're just getting tossed around something terrible up here.
Was there a layer?
Yeah, it's weird. It would get real smooth here, and then you go a little bit that way, and it'd just be super. And a couple of times the brake toggle pressure just got super soft where the wing wouldn't respond anymore. And I was like, yeah.
However, after all our excitement, we were soon confronted with a massive problem. As Leah and I reviewed the altimeter data and were trying to download it to her laptop, we soon ran into a problem with the actual data. We went through both systems on both altimeters because we have a redundancy to have two altimeters in case one fails. However, both of them were not downloading any data. They showed no flights whatsoever, and my heart soon sunk because of all our efforts today were filled with no data, which was the most vital part about this attempt, because it didn't show what our actual altitude was. So we made the call to power down one of the altimeters and keep another one running in hopes that it was just recording the entire flight instead of in intervals. And I told Jeremy to recharge the electric paramotor for the 30-minute interval, and I was going to go back up for another attempt just so we could at least have some altimeter data from today. You know, the problem we ran into is we go through all these efforts to attain these altitudes, but it all relies on the altimeters themselves. And I was worried that we didn't get any data points recorded. I was already exhausted by this point from the prior 2 flights, and my hands, well, my hands were really hurting. After all this effort, and I made the call to go back up and do another attempt. By now the winds had picked up even more, but at this point any altitude that we got would have been fine, just to know that we had some sort of altitude recorded by these altimeters. The winds of loft had increased. On my initial takeoff, the temps had actually increased, so they were right around 20 degrees on the ground with a surface wind of about 15 miles an hour. Here I'm checking the external altimeter that I have. This one is not related to the internal ones that have the official data, but it was giving me a reference point of where I was. The electric paramotor had increased charge of around 40%. And for us, that was nowhere near the 100% that we would need for the ultimate altitude and duration out of these batteries. But frankly, any altitude that we could get out of this would really yield some sort of data. I continued on with the same flight plan as I did with my first flight, and that was about 39% throttle, and my wing settings were trims all the way in for maximum lift. Turbulence wasn't near as bad as my morning flight. There was a couple of points where it got real bumpy, and the wing was definitely talking back to me, but overall it didn't really change from the morning's wind conditions. And I was actually surprised because the forecast had predicted that it was going to be far worse at the time frame that I had taken off. I had flown all the way up till engine cutoff, and at this point I felt that we amazingly had gone higher than our first flight, and that was due to a multiple of reasons. For one, I had flown north much further, which allowed a little bit less of a headwind, and I believe that got me a little bit more altitude in the end. I believe on the second attempt with 40% battery, we got nearly 26 minutes out of the battery, which to the typical paramotor pilot, that doesn't sound like a substantial amount of time, but from an electric standpoint and the temperatures that we were flying at, with a very, very small amount of charge on the second attempt, it was very impressive how long that SP140 battery lasted in the conditions that we put it through. I was beyond exhausted coming here on this landing, but I did land back at the LZ. In fact, I had landed significantly closer this second attempt than I did the first go around, so I was happy that I didn't have to do hardly any walking back. You could say that I was relieved to be back on the ground. Everybody was super ecstatic that we had gone for a second attempt. And the good news is that after reviewing the altimeter data, they actually had recorded all the flights that we had done prior. The biggest thing that we had found was that when you would power it down, it saved that flight. But if you kept it running, it just continuously recorded the data points of altitude. So we had a whole amount of data from all of our flights, and we could see that we had actually flown on this second attempt at the highest point. We had reached an altitude of 14,900 feet officially, And that in itself blew my mind because I literally had half the battery power that I did on my first flights, yet we had gone even higher. So that kind of set a benchmark of what the capability of an electric paramotor was. Now, when you think about the world altitude record and a gas-powered paramotor is nearly 24,000 feet officially, this was just a benchmark test. Given the fact that the wind and the temperature conditions that we put this electric paramotor through really proved that its capabilities was there. When we're asked if we're going to attempt a second try at the world altitude record to go even higher, the answer is yes. In fact, our projected target goal altitude is nearly 21,000 feet for our next attempt, and this will be mostly due to a much bigger wing size. With the winds that we are given this go around, I can only had utilized my 18-meter wing. But next time, we'll have a much bigger wing and even better wind conditions. That will yield a much better result. Honestly, this wouldn't have never happened without the amazing team around making this work. Jeremy in the black jacket was the owner of the electric paramotor. Without him, this would have never happened. Leah with the hat next to Jeremy, she was the official FAI observer, and she made all these records stand officially because she was there to observe the records. Daniel was the owner in the green jacket there of the trike, and he was a massive amount of help. And honestly, having friends and family there by our sides, witnessing this special moment, made this event and this attempt even more special. As for me, well, if there's one valuable lesson that I learned from this attempt, it's I'm going to wear much thicker gloves for the next go around. And of course, I'm going to enjoy this amazing bottle of champagne, as it was well earned. Lastly, for me, it was putting an American flag on the record books. It's been many years since I've seen an official record on the American side go up in the paramotor category, and that was a special feeling in itself. And it made me want to go and put more American flags on the record books, and it makes me want to encourage any other pilots out there to go break some records, make those dreams happen, and honestly, if there's a goal that you want to attain, go for it. Don't just think about it, actually go for it and make it happen because it's right there in front of you. I hope you enjoyed this episode. Hit that like and subscribe button and be sure to look out for our next attempt and any other future flying adventures. I love sharing these type of moments with everybody, and it wasn't for you guys, these type of episodes wouldn't happen. So thanks for watching.